Okay, so welcome everybody to WSET School London's webinar, taking a close look at some of the challenges currently facing the South African wine industry. Thank you all for joining. Please use the Q&A for any questions and let us know what South African wines you're drinking in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard Bamfield to introduce himself and what's going to happen this evening.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and good evening all. I have to say, while you've been introducing, I've been looking at the chat already. This is the most international audience I've ever seen. That is sensational. Okay, well, we should get a fair variety of questions, but thanks very much to all of you for joining us. My name is Richard Bamfield. I have no credentials whatsoever, really, for presenting or co-presenting a webinar on South African wines. Suffice it to say that, like all of us in the business, I enjoy wine. I enjoy drinking wine from everywhere in the world. And when I read an article by Bruce Jack recently, where he was explaining the problems that South African producers are experiencing at the moment, it just struck me very deeply that we have to try and do something to help. Richard will say a little bit more about the issues specifically, but what struck me was that because the domestic market has been closed for much of the last 10 months, an awful lot of wine that would have been sold hasn't been. And so you have a lot of tanks that are still full of last year's harvest, just when this year's harvest is beginning. And that's obviously a problem because it means that grapes could be left on the vine and this year's harvest can't be made because there isn't sufficient tank space. So over the last couple of weeks, I've just been encouraging friends, contacts, merchants, anybody to do what they can to help the South African cause, sell more South African wine, drink more South African wine, buy more South African wine. And my feeling with this, without trying to reinvent the world or anything, if lots of us individually are doing what we can, the collective impact can be quite good. And if we're drinking more South African wine, particularly in export markets, then that hopefully will encourage the merchants to reorder, and that will create tank space. So that's the thinking behind this. And WSET, Lydia, have been very supportive and obviously have a tremendous network around the world. I think South African wines probably are exported to pretty much every country to one degree or another. And so hopefully many of you will have been able to open a bottle of South African wine this evening. Do please mention what you're drinking. I can see here, Uvamira Sauvignon Blanc, that's very nice. You probably can't see this. I'm sorry, Richard, I couldn't get one of your wines at short notice, so I've got a Savage wine. Okay, I'm sure you know Duncan. And this is sorry, Richard, you would do, yeah?
I do. I was with Duncan 2 days ago.
Oh, well, there you go. Okay, so hopefully you don't resent this too much. Lismore Chardonnay, good choice. Oh, some beauty here. Sadie, oh, fabulous. Anyway, this is his Syrah Grenache Touriga Nacional and Cinsault 2014. I have to say, what I love about South Africa, almost above anything else, is the quality of the blends, red and white. I think they're fascinating. So I'm going to enjoy that. And without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Richard, and this will take the form. I suspect Richard is quite capable of talking for the next 55 minutes on his own, but I will interrupt occasionally, particularly if there are questions from the audience or particular comments. So this will take the form of a small interview in a way. But first of all, maybe Richard, I know you were quite keen to put the current situation in its larger context, okay? I suppose what I've been focusing on the last 3 weeks is the immediacy of the need to try and create tank space. But I know you're quite keen to try and demonstrate that this is not just a temporary thing, that there are broader issues to address probably.
Yes. Well, thank you, and it's lovely to be here, and welcome to everyone who's tuning in. And I saw some good bottles being drunk. So yeah, I look forward to some questions later. But yes, the immediate problem is certainly tank space. Obviously, as we head into the 2021 harvest, But the main issue is obviously the history over the last 12 months or 11 months since we went into what everybody has had, which is a lockdown. But our lockdown was obviously a lot more severe on the basis that we felt, or the government felt, that alcohol abuse, which is unfortunately a common problem in South Africa through hard liquor and other things. I'm not denying wine may be part of that, and beer, but the challenge was that they wanted to keep those that get injury or other issues with alcohol are not in the hospitals, and they felt that it was necessary to have a hard lockdown in which no alcohol was allowed to be sold whatsoever. So unlike many countries, I think there was one other country that enacted that. We had absolutely no alcohol sales from the 26th of March right through until, I think it was something like the middle of May. No, sorry, so what am I talking about? It was actually June when we were allowed to sell alcohol again. And just to kind of run through that, we had a second lockdown in August, which ran for another 6 to 8 weeks. And that then was lifted, and we seemed to be fine in the running up to Christmas. And then we hit another lockdown, which has been the most hurtful, which started actually just after Christmas Day on the 28th. And that ran until last week. So we basically also lost alcohol sales that way. But I think the immediate issue, and if I can start from the start, it would be easier, and we can run through the various issues that we've had over the last 3 sessions. The fact was that alcohol, unfortunately, and it's a political statement maybe, but it is not viewed as an important industry from the government side. There's a very strong anti-alcohol lobby. Now, I'm not denying that could well be to do with the challenges of alcohol abuse in this country, which can lead to domestic violence and other issues of pedestrians and so on and so forth, drunk driving, which is a major issue in this country. But the challenge is that when we had the lockdown, there was a major misunderstanding as actually how the alcohol business works. We were told on the 23rd of March, which happens to be my birthday, so a fantastic evening. It was even my 50th last year, so even more. We were told that not only would be lockdown, but anything to do with alcohol was not deemed an essential service. So we were in the middle of harvest, or certainly towards the tail end of harvest. We were told that certainly that wasn't deemed essential. So all our wines and grapes fermenting or sitting in the vineyard, it was seen that we wouldn't be able to even harvest them. So as we entered the Thursday night when we were going to be locked down, we had the panic stations that during tight negotiations, we wouldn't actually be able to carry on the harvest, and of course would lose all our wine in tank. So that was a major stumbling block that was addressed, thankfully, to 28 to 48 hours later, when we were allowed to continue with harvest and we were seen as winemakers essential. As viticulturists as essential, we would continue because it was a fruit, so it was seen in a favorable light. But we weren't allowed to bottle wine, label wine, and peculiarly not allowed to export wine. And this was one of the big issues, because selling wine on a domestic level clearly is something that I understand. Keeping people out of hospital beds, which could be used for COVID patients, seemed a rational thing to do. But to ban exports seemed irrational. But the problem is they banned the actual transport of alcohol, and that was a big stumbling block. In fact, so much so that we couldn't even transport our samples, our juice samples to the to the laboratories, because technically we were transporting some form of alcohol if it was fermenting. So it took another week before the laboratories even opened up, and our exports remained on a lockdown for nearly 4 or 5 weeks. So that was a massive problem, and that hurt us, especially for smaller wineries like myself, which I didn't explain a little bit. Maybe I should give some background. We're a small winery based in the Elgin region. We are seen as, I suppose, a premium entity. I started this business in 2012, so we are very much at the sort of higher end of what we make, Chardonnay and Syrah with Pinot Noir as well. So, and I also work with Naked Wines in the UK. So all of our exports, my exports total about 95% of what I sell. So I have a smaller domestic footprint. But basically, we were all under the same belt. We could not export or anything. So that was the first challenge. And also, we had an enormous amount of peculiar rules. And I think we've all experienced this around the world, where governments have become suddenly sort of autocratic in their approach. For example, we were heading into winter. So it was deemed essential that you could buy a woolly jumper Woolworths, which is our local store, or like a Marks and Spencer's, but not essential to buy a t-shirt nor a pair of flip-flops, because those were deemed a summer apparel and we should have already bought them. So it was a peculiar situation where you didn't quite know what you were doing from one minute to the other. So that luckily we continued harvesting, and then as we obviously as smaller producers, and I'm a virtual winemaker, the producers that basically rent space like I do, which means I have to rent my cellar space from a custom crush cellar, and obviously I buy my grapes in, as well as all my overheads for barrels, which are enormous, and all the various equipments and products that you need. The challenge was, as we came into April, May, you need a cash flow. And cash flow was obviously thin on the ground because we weren't able to sell wines. And just to emphasize that, we weren't able to sell it not just on a local retail basis, but we weren't allowed to sell it online. We weren't allowed to sell it to restaurants. Restaurants are all closed. So in essence, we had no cash flow for those almost until June, as I said, when we started to be able to sell. So that was a major hurdle. And one that once we could sell alcohol was a huge relief and enabled us to start at least being able to do online sales, and we could export wines. So that was the first sort of glimmer of light. The challenge was we had a very strict curfew that, if I remember correctly, started at 9 o'clock or even maybe 8 o'clock to start with, but then it moved from 9 to 9 o'clock, which meant that any retail where any restaurant establishment wasn't able to open, because effectively they had to have their staff back by 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening, which, as any restaurant knows, is going to basically mean you would have to close an hour early to get the staff back. So there was no restaurants, and no restaurant was prepared to open for such a small window. So we had no restaurants still open from that way, unless they did some form of takeaway service, which I know worldwide was one of the answers. The other problem is we also there's an awful lot of paperwork. I actually consult for 3 or 4 wineries, as well as make my wine in 2 or 3 cellars. And I think I carried something like 20 bits of paper around, which meant that I could sort of travel from here, there, and everywhere just to be able to get around. And that another sort of huge, I mean, we love paperwork here in South Africa, and there's nothing quite like it. But there is a huge challenge with having all these things, which of course changed every month, because as soon as we entered our lockdown originally was actually only 3 weeks, and then of course they extended it like most countries to 5 weeks, and then on and on and on, as the crisis didn't seem to be going away. So that was the first thing. The second issue was, once we came out of that lockdown, once we could sell alcohol, we were only allowed to sell it on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, between the hours of 10 and 6. So therefore it meant that it was a very challenging situation, in which we had a small window to be able to sell alcohol, which was good because at least people could actually have it delivered, but bad because it meant that the couriers who were doing the delivery were also doing a lot of other deliveries, like they were around the world, to try to get stuff to everybody else, because nobody could go to the shops or were limited to where they could go. So we actually had a situation where wines were taking a few weeks to arrive. So even though a lot of people had ordered during the lockdown, they actually took sort of 2 or 3 weeks to actually get to their destination. And of course, they were only allowed between Monday and Wednesday to actually receive the wine. Outside of that, they weren't allowed to receive it. And of course, for any retail establishment that was now reopened, they were obviously earning very little money, because although they had a nice bonanza, perhaps Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the main sales are obviously at the weekend. And it was typically deliberately done between 10 and 6, when a lot of people obviously were working or were at least trying to work or working from home, where it was impossible to buy alcohol. So you had this slightly challenging situation. And then suddenly in the middle of it, there was an increase during our late winter, and just a bit of wine. And this increase effectively, this sudden extra lockdown appeared on a Sunday night for a Monday morning start. And it was decided again that alcohol was to blame. And we had a sort of what in those days we called a level 4. I suppose, all these coronavirus things have we had different levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And suddenly we were back down to a level which we weren't allowed to sell alcohol, but we had a huge amount of wine on the road. So all the couriers had to stick their wine in their vans, in lorries, and just just stand there, because suddenly overnight we were banned from actually being able to sell it again. So all the deliveries that were all ready to go were now sitting there in with poor conditions and not being able to move, because transportation was actually also, the ban, it was banned to transport it. So this was an issue. However, we were still allowed to export, but meanwhile the shipping challenge for us, we use obviously Cape Town Harbour. Cape Town Harbour itself had experienced huge amounts of challenges because they also had skeleton staff during the initial hard lockdown. They have something like 6 teams working when it's in full operation. They were down to 2 teams, and those teams were not always that happy about coming to work because they also had various employees picking up the virus, and that led in turn to people not being there. So now you had the problem that you couldn't load the ship. So in fact, even though we had exports, we had stuff waiting on the docks. Luckily it was winter for us, but it was waiting there, and it took weeks before we could actually load it up to get it overseas, which meant that those who were selling couldn't obviously get payment for several months after that when the overseas agents took receipt of that wine. So it was a major problem. On top of all this, of course, we didn't really have the COVID sort of funding that a lot of first world countries had. We just didn't really get anything. As such, as a company, I took the decision to cut our pay by 25%, and I was given the option to get a loan out to pay my staff the other top-up bit just to keep them going. There was no sort of nice government aid. It was funded by our company, which we only have to pay back, luckily, in about 4 or 5 years' time. But it still means that we actually have a debt now that we have to then be able to pay out, which we have been doing over the last 7 or 8 months. That obviously did run out. Once we hit that 3rd lockdown, there has been nothing since then. So unfortunately, we had no opportunity to reimburse our employees. And that has been a major factor because, of course, for those who've read the newspapers, the unemployment in South Africa reached 37%. It's the highest in the world now. It is absolutely massive. And of course, a lot of those jobs, are in the wine industry, because obviously you've got a lot of agriculture. But more importantly, what was also quite bizarre is that the government lost something like 8 billion in customs and excise over that time because, of course, alcohol was being banned. So you had this slightly perverse situation where, of course, we'll end up probably paying, as they would expect, in higher taxes later on. But that's a political issue, so I will ignore it. I just wanted to bring another one up, which was, as we kind of moved into October, so once the second alcohol ban had lifted, we started to see a massive drop as we entered our spring. And what was lucky is we had a lot of restaurants now that were able to open, and the curfews were made slightly later to 11 o'clock. So it meant that a full service could happen and operate. And we worked, as a wine industry, we looked at various sort of incentives to try to get people to buy wines from restaurants, and restaurants themselves needed help to sell wine through various initiatives, which I think was a benefit in the long run because it will help us as an industry move closer to the restaurant industry. And for those who know the South African industry at all, it is a challenging scene when it comes to restaurants. We often get asked to pay listing fees, actually not just in restaurants, but in retail chains, to have our wines represented on their wine list. And this meant that there was a sort of a look at trying to remodulate that to allow for less people, for a ban on listings. Unfortunately, what has happened is, of course, a lot of restaurants have gone under, so we don't really know the true extent of this. I suppose, yes, I mean, as a separate point, one of the other challenges is Cape Town as a destination is also massive on the tourism trail, and we obviously haven't had tourists really since February last year, or March last year when we had the lockdown. And of course, those wine farms that receive tourists have not had any, and of course that's meant you've had a huge, massive impact on the revenue from the wine farms themselves. If I can sort of expand a little bit on that, we had a big emergency meeting with our industry, which is called Vinpro, and they have looked at ways to deal with this prior to the harvest in 2021. This was back in October, to look at the ways to mop up this massive oversupply, as Richard alluded to. I think we were looking at the time in October for a potential oversupply of 240 million litres. And that 240 million litres was going to be mopped up by various factions. We were going to hopefully produce 120 million litres of grape juice. I think we were using 50 million litres for hand sanitizer. We were going to use, obviously, 2 years to broker maybe less grape production, full stop, which would lead to itself more problems with a shrinking acreage, because we have vineyards that simply aren't making money. So this would just exacerbate that problem and expedite their downfall, which is a huge problem. But anyway, as it happens, we've actually got 349 or 59 million litres over. So we actually have way more than we had initially anticipated. But maybe if I catch up with what we've currently here. So I've got a couple of points. I mean, clearly the effects have been exacerbated by this latest lockdown, because as we were going into Christmas, whilst sales were brisk, there is a huge amount of revenue after Christmas. We have a lot of visitors from Johannesburg, apart from our overseas visitors, and none of those have been around. And of course, as we were trying to get back on our feet, we haven't been able to do that. So we're now in a situation where cellars are absolutely packed full of wine. There's nowhere for it to go. And that lake has expanded, as I said, to 340 or 50 million. I can't remember the latest figures of excess wine that has nowhere to really find a home. It's a huge, huge issue. So I think, what else did I want to say? I think that's most of it. Yeah. Maybe
I think that there'll be a chance to come back if you think of other things you wanted to say there. I realise in retrospect that I was so overexcited to get this show on the road, I didn't actually introduce you, which was a bit unfortunate. So I'm going to do that very briefly now, because it is relevant to one or two of the questions that have been asked.
Yes.
So Richard is a fellow master of wine who, when I met Richard, he was actually a winemaker at Mulderbosch, I think. Which is a name that will be familiar to many people in the audience. Still producing terrific wines, and Richard now has his own label, Kershaw, which produces single vineyard and single clone wines, from what I understand.
Yes,
an extraordinary range, a very limited production, very niche, but really exciting. Mainly Chardonnay, Pinot, and Syrah.
It's only Chardonnay, Pinot, and Syrah, and in terms
Chardonnay.
of the Kershaw wines. Yeah. And for naked wines, we make a slightly extended range, which includes a GSM, a Sauvignon, and a couple of other quirky wines, Barbera in amongst, and a Petit Verdot. Yeah,
good stuff. Okay, so the point I want to make there, and which you've just sort of made, is that Richard is involved both with sort of boutique wine in terms of Kershaw, but also something a little bit more mainstream in terms of the work that he's doing with Naked, and which means that he's also involved with sourcing grapes all over the Cape. So he's particularly well informed on the situation in the Cape at the moment. Richard, just that there have been loads of questions, as you can imagine. Do you, one which is very pertinent and may not be the one that's most pleasant to answer, do you think that we're going to see a lot of bulk South African wine hitting the market soon at relatively low prices in terms of in order to try and free up tank space, or is that already en route, do you think?
Okay, so I think that there's two parts to this question. I think that I can already tell you that the amount of bulk wine has increased a huge amount. But of course, the challenge is, obviously, as we know, we're not the only country that's had issues, and there's a lot of wine. Wine sales have gone up and gone down depending on your market. So although people who are retail orientated have benefited, and companies like Naked Wines have been an absolute godsend to us because they are online, those businesses that are allied to on-trade, whether they are in South Africa or France or Italy, have also been hit. So there's an awful lot of wine out there which is lying unsold, that's not actually getting to any destination. So there is a lot of market. There is certainly going to be more bulk wine being sold from South Africa, and there already is. We have seen that. There's definitely, but obviously not on the scale that is enough to alleviate the problem that we currently are faced with. And sure, I think the problem was put so nicely or horridly, I suppose, by one of the observers, that having tried to show after years of having good value wine, we are starting to, I would say over the last 10 years, improve our price points with high quality South African wines, which everybody is starting to enjoy, and so on and so forth. But of course, we've now knocked ourselves back to the fact that we've spent 10 years building it up, and we've knocked ourselves probably back a decade or two to a point where the value of the wines are going to be cheap as chips, as those wines are making themselves onto the market in bulk form. I saw somebody did ask about the amount of wine that's exported, and I don't have the exact figures, but it's something, I think, around 50%. But unfortunately, half of that is in bulk, and that bulk often eclipses bottled wine. And I think this year will probably do that. Not all years. There's been a steady movement towards bottled wine, but bulk wine is definitely now will definitely take precedent as the main exported wine. And that's a huge problem for us, because it's not just a question of having bulk wine overseas, but it takes, it means that any jobs in bottling locally are lost. And I've seen a bottling. We used to bottle at Mulderbush with a company, and they went bankrupt because the people started just exporting it overseas.
It's such a difficult problem, isn't it? We know that bulk wine has many advantages, environmental and otherwise, and yet at the same time, there's a tremendous cost at place of origin, which we're seeing in South America and other countries as well at the moment. And how is the 2021 harvest looking? You're obviously on the brink of that at the moment.
Yeah.
What's the mood, and what are people going to do? How are they approaching it?
So actually, I sort of almost didn't answer the second part of what I was going to say, and that is that what I've seen with winemakers, I know winemakers who are in good wineries. We're not talking about wineries that are not sure what to do. I think that just to kind of iterate, actually, I didn't reiterate it, but Vinpro mentioned that between 80 and 160 wineries will probably go bankrupt, almost certainly, and that will now be towards the higher total because of the recent lockdown. But what you're finding is, of course, you've got a lot of wineries which are in good positions, i.e. they are fairly successful, profitable, well-known to the international industry, but have wine that they couldn't bottle. They decided that, for example, they were only going to bottle half of the wine to, avoid having, too much wine on the market, because, of course, they've lost so much sales over the last year. Now, that then means that they have to sell the rest of it. And some of these guys, I've spoken to a few, they just have no idea what to do. They've never sold bulk wine, and the quality is great. They don't know how much it should cost. Of course, in many cases, some of them will price it lower just to get rid of it, which makes total sense, which means that there'll be a lot of quite smart wines, bottled under weird labels that will be pretty good. But then obviously some of them are pricing it too high because they assume, well, this is how much it's cost us to make, and of course won't sell it at all. So at the moment, I heard somebody I spoke to the other day, will remain nameless, but they said then this is the most disappointing harvest they're looking at right now. And I can tell you right on the vine, actually in the field, is some really good fruit. We've had one of the most spectacular seasons, some of the coolest summer we've seen, perhaps the result of a La Nina effect, although that shouldn't be so much on the coast. It is amazing. We've never had such cool weather, fantastic acidity, and the crop is looking pretty good. It's not a bumper crop, but it's looking good, and we expect something really special. So it is very disappointing, and of course, that leads to a second issue. There's a sort of delusion because, of course, you've now got a lot of grape growers who are now who have been cut off. I know a number of them, and I'm just talking what I know. I mean, this is nothing in the wine industry, but you've got people who have made a decision, perhaps back in October, to contract the grapes, hoping that the grape sales are the wine sales are going to be continuing to go up as that second lockdown finished, and suddenly January arrives and they're in a massive lockdown, and now they've got no sales and they're now cutting grape supplies. So you're having people who I'm speaking to have suddenly 50, 60 tons of grapes that they just haven't got a home for. And it's already January. We're already now into the season where, we haven't got much time to make a decision whether to take them. So I think this is a huge problem. And I do know that there will be a lot of people who will just simply not pick their grapes. They will just have to leave them on the vine, which will be extremely sad.
It is really sad, and I suppose one of the reasons this all struck me as so desperate in the first place is because even before the pandemic, the South African wine business was not in an easy place. I visited the Cape last, I think it was 4 years ago, so not recently, but even then, we were commenting on how profitable the business is. And I think there are a lot of South African wine producers who even then weren't particularly profitable. And this has obviously, this has been a hammer blow to many. Which are the, as a matter of interest, and someone has asked, which are the biggest bulk export markets for South Africa? Do you know?
Yeah, I think, well, the UK, Sweden and Germany, I would say probably the biggest.
Okay.
I don't have the statistics, but certainly, certainly Germany and the UK, perhaps Sweden, possibly, because obviously the bag-in-box, but they also are doing bag-in-box locally.
Yeah.
So that maybe...
Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, so if they can do it locally, they will probably make it locally.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because doing bag-in-box locally, it solves one or two of the problems locally, and obviously it is it's less weight to transport as well. What about Canada? Is South Africa's exporting monopolies in Canada?
I'm not aware of exporting a lot of bulk to Canada, I have to be honest. Obviously, with the way they work, I wouldn't have thought they would be doing an awful lot. I mean, there are certainly in the US there is a trend. I know there are companies that do a little bit of export in bulk to the US, and possibly increasing so, because the advantage of bottling it in the US means you now have the opportunities to use their 3-tier system to sell it directly to any state. Whereas if you import it, obviously you have less of a frame to be able to export it to every state, because you now are, it's already been bottled outside the country. But I know if it's bottled in the country, it is a lot easier to then sell it directly to any state at all, simply because it's been bottled there. But I don't know how much is being sent in that, to be fair with you.
No, okay. One good question here is, when lockdown, we know that I think it's about 10 days ago now that the domestic prohibition on alcohol sale was lifted. When that's happened, and that's probably the second or third time that's happened, have people gone mad and just is there evidence of people just stocking up into to make sure that for when it happens again, they're supplied?
Okay, so yes, interestingly, so one big thing that has taken place, and I think this is a universal thing, but in South Africa, it isn't so much because our distribution is less rigorous, I suppose. But interestingly, yes, certainly with the lockdowns, a lot of people have bought far more wine. Instead of buying the bottle, I buy a case. Instead of buying one case, they bought 2 or 3 cases. That's definitely very true. And that has led to a massive increase in sales for both online and, of course, direct to customer. So direct to customer has really come of age, I would say. For us as a small business, it's been fantastic in that sense, because we have been able to do a lot more than we usually would. And obviously, as everybody knows, direct to customer is a more profitable avenue than any other way. So I think that there has been a lot more, and there's been certainly those who in the pound seats know what they're doing have been able to sell more. And yes, we've had those bonanzas. But the interesting part of it is, yes, I mean, we are still in this situation. I mean, even now, I'm talking to you today, we can still only sell alcohol from Monday to Thursday. So we are, oh no, sorry, actually, we have changed it now for wineries, they can open, but there still are challenges in the retail sector. So that hasn't gone away. And for direct to customer, of course, that has also had a massive pressure on couriers, because, of course, now everybody's doing direct to customer. So unless they have their own courier or own driver, that has been challenging. But yes, there's been a huge amount of increase. We've seen a massive increase ourselves, for sure.
Okay, really good. So there are so many questions here. I'm struggling to get through them all. Let's just go to, yes, I did mean to ask, in terms of the pandemic, what effect is that having on workforce for the harvest and that sort of thing? Is it still, we've talked about the commercial impact of the pandemic. Yeah. What impact is it having on manpower and local resources? So
in a way, we were, as an industry, if you, well, not perhaps now, but if you'd spoken to me in October, I would have said, if there was going to be a worldwide pandemic, yeah, it was the best time to have it, because we were nearing the end of harvest, And so the days leading straight into the lockdown, just afterwards, we were still picking for another week or two. It was the problem. So, for example, obviously, social distancing. This was before the masks were so mandatory here, but social distancing meant that buses that shipped the workers in could only be half full. So whilst we might have started picking at, say, 6:30 or whatever, whenever the sun got up, we were only able to bring half the workforce in, and then the next other half would only get there at sort of 8:30. So you had a much, much slower pick. Now, for us personally, we were onto the Syrah, and I'd rather have my Syrah picked a little bit later in the day when it's a little bit warmer. Otherwise, it's too blinking cold, and we do all natural ferment anyway. So I didn't mind that so much, but you definitely saw a huge slowdown. And I think going into this harvesting, where the social distancing is still continuing, clearly, obviously now we all have mask wearing as well, that may well have an impact on speed of harvest pick. And that could impact us as we go forward. As such, we were fortunate because we didn't really see it so much during the winter when clearly everything was in the cellar. What we did see, however, is that if there are any silver linings, we had less people in the cellar. But of course, from a personal standpoint, as you know me quite well, I worked out because we had time, I spent about 90, I think in 2019, I spent 93 days outside of South Africa. In 2018, I spent something like 92 days. So last year I spent precisely 7 being in France, and that meant I was in the cellar an awful lot more. So I was able to do quite a lot of other work, which I wouldn't normally do. So in fact, I was much more on top of my 2020s than any other vintage. So that was a bonus, but that wasn't, obviously that was just an offshoot. For I think many others, it was a huge challenge. And clearly, in larger wineries where you had to cut the workforce, there was a massive problem. Yeah.
A number of people have commented on normally the importance of the tourism industry to the South African wine business. Yes. And obviously that has been decimated, or it's been non-existent for much of the last 10 months. Yeah. What examples have there been? What examples have you seen of how people, producers or merchants, have responded really well to the situation? In terms of maybe innovation and imagination.
Well, I suppose those that it's difficult to cite particular ones, but I mean, those that have been much more online and have been a little bit more rigorous in promoting that message online have definitely benefited. Those that have been on sort of, in meetings and in areas, I mean, there was one earlier on today where you are connecting with people via video link or on some form of social media has definitely been useful. I think outside of that, restaurants that have been trying to promote wines and being helped by wineries to do that, as I mentioned earlier, has helped be an initiative for those both parties. I don't know in terms of outside of that, because it's not been easy to be that innovative. In fact, I'll just actually draw a point here, because one of the challenges we had after the lockdowns was that the government didn't want to see lots of people queuing up buying wine, because they thought that would be another way for the virus to spread. So they were very against us doing any advertising. And in fact, that was almost a condition that was put into the latest lockdown release to avoid any advertising, to avoid anybody queuing up. Now, obviously, people will do that because they haven't had wine for months or weeks. So it makes no sense. So there's been a little bit of, I think, an approach where they haven't tried to push the wine or beer, because that might lead to further antagonization from the government in that they are, promoting alcohol when they should actually be not promoting it at all to avoid having people, end up in hospital.
Yes, which obviously, yeah, that's right. Has there been any, you mentioned that the government was supporting in terms of loans up to a point. Is there any government support in the vineyard in terms of, I don't know, reduced yields or supporting viticulture, supporting agriculture?
No, nothing. Only support, there was obviously there was a TERS initiative, which was basically based on UIF, where there was a small sum paid out to those that weren't able to work. but that fund has been incredibly difficult to access, and also took weeks to access for many, so that it was a huge problem. And outside of that, for sort of other workers, there's been these loans that have been given. We took out a loan with an interest free, but we would have to pay it back, obviously, over the next 5 years, which we basically were then able to pay our workers. And I mean, we don't have a big staff, but that was a way of doing it. And of course, those bigger companies will be taking on huge loans. Sure, they'll have the interest free, but they won't they won't be getting it for free. So there's no benefit. So no, it's been a huge problem. That's definitely a major challenge.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, one's always trying to look at for the positives that can come out of something like this. I mentioned earlier that much of the South African wine industry was already not particularly profitable. This is going to have tipped some companies over the edge. Yeah. Do you think that a reckoning was maybe necessary, and that actually the industry could emerge stronger and more robust in some ways as a result of this?
I think that yes, so the upside could well be that obviously those that were in financial challenges could arguably have entered financial challenges prior to COVID, and the COVID has just exacerbated their challenges. So in a way, they were unprofitable. So that certainly is maybe a part of that. I think, though, the two issues that we will have is obviously wines that were destined for export and were not exported will be dumped in the local market and sold off as cheap as chips prices. That will have a massive negative impact on our pricing locally, because people will pick up stuff for nothing. And they will happily sell it at cost just to get rid of the stuff. And then secondly, I think that the growers themselves are faced with a very uphill battle. Many of our growers have held our prices steady. One or two have reduced the prices, but the price of vineyards has not changed. There is still a massive need to be profitable, and most vineyards are not. So that would be very difficult. And of course, a lot of people will now not be buying from some vineyards, and that will then have a massive impact financially on the farmer at a time when we're expecting, thousands more hectares to be grubbed up. And unfortunately, as those that follow South African wine, a lot of those will be older vines, simply because they just don't produce the yield. And although some of them are well known and won't be ripped up, some of them are less well known, unfortunately don't quite make it onto the labels of the superstar producers, so will be ripped up and just simply be lost in the fray. And that will be sad. And so, unfortunately, that thing. Having said that, less grapes may be a benefit in the long run, perhaps in a few years' time. But I think the problem is that this will continue for the next 2 years, because obviously we're not going to get rid of that amount of wine that we've now accumulated this year. And then we've got a new harvest coming in. And despite the fact that one can make plans and strategies as to how much you're going to sell in 2022, we've just no idea. We would like to feel that there's going to be a huge sort of, somebody said a sort of golden age, the 1920, the swinging, the singing 20s, like it was in after the Spanish flu, and that we're all going to suddenly be buying wine like by the bucket. But who knows? Maybe we are, and we'll quickly get rid of through that wine, but maybe we're not going to be. We're going to be a little more cautious. But I think the biggest problem is, and worldwide, is the fact that the goalposts have changed. So, where before you could say, well, we're going to sell this much through restaurants, this much through off licenses, this much online. Everything has changed, and the problem is now we all have to change with it. And those that have the smartest and brightest strategies will be the ones that win, and those that don't have a strategy will be the ones that lose.
No, I think it's absolutely true. And I mean, through all of this, I think it's really important to keep track of trends in the key export markets and how to make sure that South Africa is positioned to make the most of those. It's been mentioned in the questions that if you take the UK, and I think in some other markets as well, Germany as well, both keg wines and canned wines particularly are gaining traction. And I know I've did a tasting of canned wines this morning in the UK, and several of them actually was sourced from the wine was sourced from South Africa. And I think that given that South African bulk wine is particularly good value at the moment, sadly good value, I'd have thought South Africa is really well placed to make the most of that particular opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, if there is an opportunity, it's a rather sort of, it sounds a rather nasty way of saying this, but I mean, there's been a lot of interest from China, obviously, because South Africa has generally not done that brilliantly in China, and obviously now with the challenges of political issues with Australia, there's an opportunity for South Africa to work harder at selling those wines. Unfortunately, we don't have an agreement like Chile or New Zealand, so we will be paying 15% more. But there again, our wines are 15% cheaper anyway. That may well be, a chance and an opportunity. Who knows? But yeah, it's an uphill battle.
Yeah. There's a question here, an open question, which might have been a good one to end with, but I like it, so we'll have it now.
Okay.
What is the best way for us to help? Buying South African wine, donating to charities, generating awareness. How do you see? We have people from all over the world here.
Yeah.
What's your positive message?
Well, I've been speaking to a lot of people about this, and I think that it's a tricky one with charity because obviously, there's been amazing initiatives here, and I mean, my wife was involved with a soup kitchen, and all that sort of thing. We also donated to help get people fed and at least have a decent meal during the lockdowns. But I think that can all work from this side. That's what wineries are good at, and others. We're a community of apple farmers here as well. We're not just wine. But I think the concept of buying South African wine will help the fact that more wine will be sold, which means that there's more opportunities for us to go forwards, because it's always going to be the effect that we need to sell more wine. That's the honest answer. And I'm a pragmatist, and I worry charity is good, but unfortunately in a country where, we are not known for being that straight and a little bit more corrupt, I worry that charity doesn't end up with the right people. So, here, as my wife said, I mean, she's a big person when it comes to charity. And actually, as Bruce mentioned in his article, being out there serving soup, that's an absolute direct charity thing. There's no question. There's no bullshit, if I can say that it's a direct thing. Whereas, on the other side, from afar, buying the wines from South Africa themselves is already a major bonus, because it enables us to have more wines being sold, and especially if you can buy them in a bottle that's perhaps been bottled here. I'm not saying that's a necessity, but it definitely helps us in the sense that, I mean, just to give you an example, the bottling manufacturer is almost bankrupt in South Africa. Now, that's not unfortunately through wine, it's through beer, because obviously the beer industry has been very badly hit. But that is a major problem. We only really have one bottle supply in South Africa. So if it goes under, that's a major problem. So, if we can buy them from South Africa, that would be great. And you'll see that with the little A number on the back that will show that it's been bottled here. That would be my message.
Okay, thank you, Richard. A couple of more delicate issues here, I guess, which
okay, yep.
to address if you're happy to.
Yeah.
One question is, I mean, obviously the South African government is very concerned about alcohol abuse, and particularly during lockdowns, hence the domestic ban. What part do you think the wine industry plays in that? And the question specifically says, what parts it play as a result of liquid payment?
Okay, in terms of liquid payment, it plays no part. That is not a system that is used anymore. Payment is all done. There's no company I know of. It's illegal for a start. The wine industry would account for a very small fraction of that. I mean, the honest answer is that it is a huge problem with hard liquor and beer, and of course, a lot of that is then made locally, obviously in those provinces where they can then sell it off and sell it out. It certainly won't be from bottled wine. I mean, we'd certainly had problems back in the day, and that was the DOP system which you're referring to. The liquid sort of sales is illegal, and also putting it into what they call a pap sack, which it's a rather sort of a dear term that sounds like a good thing, but it was basically a bag in box without the box, so just a bag, and the bag was like 10 or 15 liters, and you would sling it behind you and just sort of suckle on it. That is all illegal. You can't do any of that anymore. And therefore, in a way, the wine industry doesn't really apply in that sense to the challenges that we've had. And in fact, if one looks at it, a lot of the problems have been, certainly in the Eastern Cape and up in Joburg, where there is a lot more hard liquor sold and beer. I mean, we have to put it into rational terms. The average amount of wine drunk in South Africa is something like 7 or 8 liters per head per year. It's not a lot. We still have a lot to go before we have a real wine drinking culture. So I wouldn't really say that it was such a valid thing, and certainly not in a liquid payment terms. No.
Okay, and another on the more delicate side, how can look, in the past the South African wine industry has been accused of racism. How can end consumers be sure that South African wines are produced in fair conditions?
Well, I think that charge has been leveled there was an investigative sort of report done on that a few years ago, and it was leveled at 2 wineries in particular. And those 2 wineries are known, and that's something that was unfortunate. I wouldn't really say it's a particular thing. I mean, I don't encounter it at all anymore. I mean, it's not really something I've encountered personally since I've lived here. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But I wouldn't really say that was something that was that relevant to the whole industry. I mean, for those who know the Cape very well, we have different cultures here. So we don't just talk of black and white. We talk of black, white, and coloured. So whilst there is the coloured community is very much the mainstay of who work in the wine industry, and the black culture is very much also in the industry, but not quite at the same level, because it's more populated with coloured, and that's a different sort of dynamic. I would say, if anything, the challenges are that we have obviously an awful lot of overseas. I mean, just in our wineries, there's a lot of Malawians and Zimbabweans. There's massive amounts of Zimbabweans. So I don't really see that as a major problem at all. And in fact, interestingly, I think in many cases the challenges are not a wine industry relation. The problem where the racist card has been played, especially in South Africa, is the fact that the black economic empowerment, or broad-based black, which is the BBBEE sector, is very difficult in agriculture, because unlike main industries where shareholder value can be attributed or split up to various parties, and they can have a solid sort of revenue in a factory that makes widgets or whatever it does, the wine industry is a problem because you need to buy land, and land is hugely expensive, and you are likely to not be profitable for a great many years. And unfortunately, therefore, it means that for those BBE projects to happen, they need a huge amount of capital to get into the industry in the first place, because they can't afford the land. So now you have this challenge where, therefore, the land is still occupied and by families who have been there for generations. And although there's a lot of initiatives on the ground, it isn't always to do with land. That's where I would say the biggest. So in a way, the industry, or certainly the government, struggles with the fact that that's not happened, that transformation. But it's unfortunately never really going to happen that much anyway, because of that problem. And if I put it into really stark terms, the fact is that, I was talking to a guy, and anybody listening here who's living in Stellenbosch probably will be out there for me. But in Stellenbosch, if you look at the price of land per hectare, no wine should be under 100 Rand. It wouldn't make any money that way. And I can tell you now how many wines are under 100. 100 Rand is about £5 in South Africa, where our taxes are very low. That would translate into probably about a £15 wine in the UK. No wine under that in fact, any wine produced under that is actually making a loss. Because if you look at the land values, it's about 100,000 euros per hectare. So there's no way you can be making a profit on that. So arguably, there's no way anybody would buy into that as a black empowerment project, because it's completely untenable, simply because there's no way they can make money. And this is the problem. It just doesn't work. And I think that's always been a challenge. I think it's always a difficult challenge. As much as one has tried to make it work, it's not really worked.
Is there any sign? I mean, looking to the future, you say that there's vineyards will be, obviously grapes will be left on the vine this year, and vineyards will be grubbed up because they're no longer profitable. And yet at the same time, we know that in many markets, premium South African wines are selling pretty well, and they are beginning to command high prices.
Yes.
Are there any organizations or bodies or cooperatives that are raising funds to save these vineyards? How would people, it may be one area that some people can support, is actually by joining funds to try and save some of these vineyards, because the premium end of the market, it strikes me as being growing faster than the bulk end of the market in recent years.
Okay, I think obviously this is an interesting question, and I will try and answer it in as brief as time as possible. But the biggest challenge that we have, and we've always had this in South Africa, is that we've always had this sort of top-down approach where we've showed the world what we can do in the premium sector, and we can do it with aplomb, I would argue, and I'd like to think people feel that we can, where our wines can command a premium price. Not necessarily the highest premium prices that you can see from other New World countries, but certainly attract a premium price. Our challenge has always been our biggest three suppliers don't dominate the market as they do in places like Australia or California or America. And of course, those they can not just dominate the market, but they can then supply their respective markets in places like the UK, where supermarkets take 70% of their volume, because that is 70% of their trade. So ultimately, what the problem is that our big three should be about 70% of the market, where no one touches them. They can work on a very small margin of about 32% GP. They can sell happily because of volume, and that's how they operate. And they can produce fantastic wines of that ilk to a thirsty market in any country of the world. What the problem is that you then have the 30%, which should then be the highest premium wines. In our country, our 70% is only literally, I think, 35%. We have very few well-known brands when you can consider, we're the ninth biggest producer in the world. We have a Kamala and a few others, but there's very little that are commanding those sorts of prices across the range from those big three. I mean, I think one would struggle to really feel what those are. I mean, perhaps Nederburg would be one of the candidates that could encompass that. But when you consider a place like Australia, where they've got a variety of larger wineries that can not just come out at sort of a cheap level like Penfolds, but also go right up to a very, very quality product where people are prepared to pay the highest prices. We don't have any of that. So what that creates is an interesting paradox, because when we are pricing our wines, when I mentioned earlier about being 100 Rand, all our premium guys should really be at over 100 Rand or 200, because they can't compete at that under 100 Rand. We should be leaving that to the big three to fight over and work towards selling those to the supermarkets. But what we do is instead we compete with them. And by competing, we actually instead of, we should be working towards a 50% GP or higher. 70% is where we should be. But I mean, obviously many don't manage that. If we did that, we would actually be much more successful. But unfortunately, we don't. We work and compete with we actually have brands that compete with the big three. I mean, for years, Van Leeuwenhoek's Four Cousins was the biggest brand on the market, and they're a private winery. They're not actually one of the big three, but they are so massive, they can compete adequately at that level. That, to me, is great for them. Obviously, they've done a fantastic job marketing, but it means that we clearly have been inadequate at marketing from the big three. So even though that's probably, again, they probably won't like me saying that, but I think what we've done is we've always ended up having, wineries that sell overseas. They have premium wines for sure, but then they can produce this sort of easy drinking, cheap and cheerful wine. And we go, yeah, we'll have some of that, I think, because we haven't got anything in our portfolio from one of the big three to match that. And I think that's always been the challenge. So what it also then has an impact is that if you have a wine at 30 Rand or 40 Rand, and then you have one at 140 and 150, and I'm sort of talking in Rand so we can compare, $5, $10, $20. It's very hard to justify a wine at then $100, $200, $300, simply because you can't say, well, hang on, they make a $5 wine. So yeah, that would be slightly naive perhaps, but just a sort of a general thought on where the challenges lie there.
Yes. Gosh, it would be so helpful if South Africa did have some stronger wine brands. I think one of the aspects of Australia that you've mentioned that has been so strong is because they do have the strong brands at retail. Yeah. Supermarkets find it easier to work with them. And if you do want to turn on volume, promotions through supermarkets are the way to do it. And if you haven't got the strong brands, it's very, very difficult to do that. So I agree with you totally that lovely though it would be to concentrate on South Africa being a producer of fabulous boutique wines, the reality is that it's got to get better at selling the branded wines as well. I think that's very true. We have, Richard, there are so many questions and I feel very inadequate because I've got through about half of them, I think, but we are going to have to close it off there. Thanks so much for your participation, both in terms of the questions, the chat. I tried to keep in touch with all of that, but failed in many ways. Terrific to see so many of you drinking really good South African wine. I think all I can say is Richard has said, and I think this is so true, unfortunately, the impact of the current situation is going to be felt for years to come, at least 2 years to come. And so I know lots of wine countries deserve our support, but I just hold a place for South Africa. Make sure that you continue to support it, particularly at the moment. I think right now, in the immediate future, it's the country that needs our help more than any other. And I would love to think that as an industry, and I use that word guardedly, as an industry, as a wine trade, I would love to think that in future we can react to these situations more positively and speedily than we are on this occasion. Hopefully more of that in the future, but that's something that there's so many conversations to be had out of this, and let's hope that we can draw some positives from it as well. Richard, thanks very much indeed. You've got to get back to Vintage. You're managing your team of pickers tomorrow, or maybe I'm not sure, but I hope so, and good luck with the Vintage. I think many of the audience will look forward to staying in touch with you and looking out for Kershaw wines wherever we can find them in future.
Well, thank you, and thanks for everyone to being so supportive. I'm seeing a lot of messages on the right-hand side here, and you know it's fantastic. It's great to be here and explain the situation here.
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, WSET. Good night.
Good night.